Hi everybody, Sigal here, coming at you again from my home office. I'm hoping that my review finds you guys all in really good health and great spirits and enjoying some pretty gorgeous weather here in Toronto. I want to start this video by first of all just acknowledging and apologizing the lack of consistency in which the videos of late have been coming to you. I'm really, really appreciative for the plethora of positive feedback that I'm receiving from you, and the little nudges from time to time as well. New, when is the next one coming? I really have to apologize. It's just been super, super busy, and I was just not able to find the time to put the source sheets together and record this video for you, although I did watch the last two episodes some time ago. So my apologies for the delay, but I hope that it will have been worth the wait. I'm not going to lie, I definitely had a huge sense of trepidation about watching the last two episodes, possibly because I knew what was going to be happening, and I figured maybe in my own small way, if I didn't watch the episodes, I wouldn't have to see the reality unfold as we all know that it did. But regardless, I had really a lot of notes that I took while watching those episodes that I'm excited to share with you today. As well, did some research and provided you a couple of or a few source sheets that we'll go over toward the end of the video, and of course to announce where we're going from here. So I'm going to start with episode 5. It was very poignantly titled Fish Gotta Swim and begins on the 8th of March in 1963. I'm going to question for you to think about why they named this episode Fish Gotta Swim. I'm still questioning myself as to why the director chose this name when he really had a lot of choice here. But we'll potentially circle back to that. But I would love to hear from you via email or Facebook, whatever your comfort is. Why do you think they named the episodes the way they did in these series? But I digress. Basically, the episode opens with Ellie's alter ego, Thabit, holding a party, which actually turns into a bit of an orgy, which he invites a whole bunch of Syria's upper echelons within the military and otherwise to attend this party. Meanwhile, eminently, the Ba'ath Revolution of 1963 is about to occur. In fact, as the party is in full progress, we are shifted scenes to the Ba'ath revolutionary soldiers overthrowing the government, arresting the president, and of course taking over the radio station. One can only surmise, if you're going to be putting forward a revolution, not only do you need to secure the government positions, but you also need to secure the country's mode of communication so that you can continue to control the message, which is what we see happening at the beginning of the episode. In my notes at the beginning, I had a note to myself, it's unclear whether or not he's actually unfaithful. I think that as things progress, and as he comes back to Israel and is returned for the last time to Syria, I was more comfortable in answering that question to myself, that yes, he was likely physically unfaithful to his wife. Again, all part of the many sacrifices that he had to make to fulfill his mission. I realize it's one of the questions I asked you to think about, and I would definitely going to give you my thoughts as I get further along. It's really also very, very interesting, the initial radio correspondence that sent out to the residents and civilians in Syria. I found the use of peaceful transition of power really, really interesting and very powerful. I think that the director was smart to include it. It definitely foreshadows and definitely is a nod, I think, to the reality on the ground at the time, in that it's not the first time that the message, the communicated message to the people, was very, very, very far from the actual facts on the ground. all part of maintaining a facade and a method of controlling the population to the will of the government. Another question that I found myself asking, and I'm not sure whether or not I came up with an answer, was why did he position himself in the window as the colonel was being arrested? Was it important to Ellie that the colonel know that he was complicit, that he was part of the process that basically brought about the Bath Revolution? And if so, what did he feel he would have to gain from the colonel being in possession of that information? Or was it just a nod to his humanity? Um, you know, just basic human nature to be curious. He knew what was happening because obviously he was read into the plan, but he just couldn't get over his natural instinct to be curious and be to be someone watching from a window. I'm not sure which of the two is correct. It may very well be up to the viewer to interpret. I have to say I'm kind of leaning more towards another way in which the audience is meant to come into direct contact with Ellie's humanity, knowing and understanding that the director was trying to highlight the human piece, both for Ellie and for his wife. I'm sort of leaning toward that answer, but again, unclear. And part of the joy, I think, of being a viewer of a series that's as well done as this one. We then very quickly shift to a year later, 1964. The same radio announcer who was pushed out of his position in the 1963 Bath Revolution has now been promoted by that same governing power to the position of Minister of Information. We see that there is a continued friendship between Ellie's cover Thabit and this minister, which again positions him in a very, very lucrative position in terms of his mission as an Israeli spy, being able to have conversations, read confidential communiques and all kinds of other secrets, committing things to memory, and of course, later breaking into those offices to take pictures without being able to have that kind of a relationship to parlay. He would have been severely challenged in the type of information that he was able to get to Israel in such a timely fashion. At the same time, we switch back to his nemesis, Sweedani, who has become, if it's even possible, more paranoid. Again, a really brilliant nod by the director to factual information, as is the case with a lot of Arab countries, but in particular in the case of Syria. Having the Ba'ath Revolution was a coup d'etat. And of course, because of the way they came into power, one can only surmise and understand why there was this heightened sense of paranoia. They would go through ministers like playing cards. Whenever someone became suspicious or came under undue suspicion, rather than investigating or whatever, the easiest thing to do was to replace them, which was in fact, if you look into the history books, what was happening at the time. Unfortunately, it's this paranoia of Sweedani that we know going forward in the story is going to, in many ways, lead to the demise of Ellie's cover. But at the time, it definitely lends itself well to giving the viewer a sense of what was happening within the governance at the time. Sad discord where we see that scene where Ellie ignores the previous nephew, his friend, of the colonel, in order to protect himself in the mission. You can't help but feel for this individual, which in itself is again a huge testament to the director, because I don't think as a daughter of Israelis and as a young Jewish woman, I'm meant to have a lot of compassion for any of the characters other than the Ellie and his wife, and of course the Mossad. But the director does, I think, intend to strike those humanitarian chords within the viewership, and he does a really good job of it. Um, then, of course, you move to that 18th anniversary of the independence of Syria and the party, where we meet the character Muhammad bin Laden, and of course, um, a very young son. We're introduced to Muhammad in terms of his relationship with the president. He's a big construction mogul in the Arab countries, hailing from Saudi Arabia. Um, and of course, that whole discord with him trying to solicit Thabit's participation in what we surmise is a military operation. One can surmise it either has something to do with Shalal, or as we come to understand, potentially with the water diversion project, which we're going to get to a little bit further along in the review. Um, you know, seeing the young Osama bin Laden there, I don't know how much that needed to be there. I have to say, I found myself feeling a little bit cringy at that scene. I didn't think it really needed to be there in terms of plot development. It was just a little bit, I don't know, missed the beat for me. But I guess, potentially wanting to put the thing in a broader spectrum, a broader context might have been what was motivating the director, but it was a bit of a miss for me. Um, Thabit tries to gain some more information about the project from Muhammad, albeit under the auspices of protecting his own business interests, flawlessly executed in terms of trying to get more information for the Mossad, but obviously doing so in a way that made perfect sense and maintained his cover without raising any eyebrows. Sadly, this character was even more cautious than anyone would have surmised, and is absolutely not neglectful, is absolutely unwilling to give any further information. And of course, Ellie really has no chance but to go forward and participate anyway. We then switch scenes again, I think setting us up for a soon to come switch back to the Israeli side of things, where we see Thabit buying dresses for his girlfriend, who we know is the daughter of the current president. Again, strategically huge in terms of maintaining these relationships and getting into the inner circles, and obviously gaining him access, and for Israel, access to really, really, really sensitive and important information. But again, I found myself thinking a lot about Nadia, and I thought about their marriage, and I thought about this question of so much sacrifice, again, really as a nod to the director achieving the goal that he had set out in portraying the story in the way that he did. It's in this discord where he's buying the dresses for his girlfriend that he sees this Singer's sewing machine in the back of the cupboard as he's paying the bill. And of course, it reminds him of Nadia. We immediately are treated to a flashback to her sitting at her sewing machine, which always bites her as she's doing her work as a seamstress. And he, of course, begins an inquiry into the process of how much it is and will you ship it. We can, of course, infer from there what his plan is going to be to purchase the machine and obviously send it back home to Israel to his wife, Nadia. An important fact that's going to come, which is going to show its relevance as the story progresses. Okay. From there, we go back into more of the meat and potatoes of the mission. Once again, we see that he was given strict instructions of when to transmit, of how often to transmit. And for a while, he seems to follow his direction. But that gets replaced with a cockiness that I'm going to argue is part of the reason that leads to his ultimate demise. He begins transmitting outside of regular times. And this sets him up for some bad habits going forward. then there's, of course, we move to this, more gut-wrenching scene, as I had mentioned previously with his friend Mazi, who he had been ignoring up until now when he had been trying to get Ellie's attention on the streets. And he finally confronts him, asks him if he was complicit in his uncle's arrest. The story doesn't actually require that Ellie answers. I don't think that any answer that he could have given would have been satisfactory either for the character or for us as the viewer. It was the difficulty of the exchange that was valuable. We see him spit on him, which is, I wrote in my notes, definitely foreshadows what's to come, sadly. And we switch back to this discord between him and his girlfriend. She's pushing him to move the relationship forward, which, if this was a real relationship, would make total sense. And even one would argue from a strategic position, it was questionable what his reaction was, which was to break things off. But I think, again, as a nod to the mastery of the director, it was important for us to see him reach his breaking point. Up until now, we had seen Ellie's character as one of 150% resolve, commitment, and dedication to fulfilling the mission for which he was sent to complete. We don't get any glimpses, really, since the beginning of the series into any kind of trepidation. In fact, we see his behavior escalate in cockiness. We see his confidence rise the longer he's there. We see these exchanges in which one really has to question, how awful is it really on the reality for him? How much is he missing his wife versus how much is he actually enjoying the hobnobbing that he has to do to maintain his cover? But I think at this point, we needed to remember or be reminded as viewers of what he had given up, and to understand the human condition, in that every human being has a limit and has a breaking point. And I think that the reality of his girlfriend pressing him toward marriage, which would have, I think, forced him to really and truly cut himself off from the love of his life and from his real wife and his real relationships and his real marriage, and just make his cover all the more real, was a breaking point that he just couldn't do. No matter how dedicated, no matter how much of a Zionist, no matter how much he was willing to sacrifice, that was just too much. And we as viewers needed to see that. He breaks up with his girlfriend. He, in the first time in a long time, loses control. He breaks things in the apartment, and then in a masterfully, visually beautiful scene, we go back to the bread and butter, which I've argued all along has been the euphemism for the love relationship that he has, that connection that he has with his wife Nadia on the other side of the fence. And it was beautiful. He knows he's losing himself. He's worried that he's already lost himself. So he cuts off the relationship. He breaks things. He loses himself. He loses control, and he comes back to what's real, back to Nadia. It's at that time that we shift from Syria back to Israel. And what do we see? We see Nadia sitting at a table, and she's writing a letter. We don't understand who she's writing to until a tiny bit further along. And that exchange is gut-wrenching. What is she doing? She's writing letters to her daughters from Ellie because her husband, Ellie, isn't writing to them. And obviously has to have been, from a sacrifice perspective, absolutely horrible for her to have to do this, but completely understandable that in a position of a caring parent, as a mother, raising two daughters in absence of their father, that in order for her to protect their development, she would do this exercise. But for her as a character, as a person, must have been so painful. I can't even come up with the words to put forward to you how I felt watching that scene. Then, the very, very important twist of fate that sets us up for the next chapter. His brother, who's on the Egyptian desk, we know this to be fact in terms of what we saw in the series and also in terms of the history. They were reticent in actually bringing Eli on board to be their man in Damascus because his brother was already in the Mossad working on the Egyptian desk. We see that because of some fluke of events, his brother gets asked to fill in on the Syrian desk, and he is receiving the coded messages from Eli, not knowing that Eli is Eli, and Eli not knowing that his brother is the person receiving the message on the other side. Now, again, as I'm going to argue, as part of an overinflated sense of confidence and a feeling of cockiness, he elongates the period of transmission, staying on the line to have a conversation with the person on the other side about the game that we're seeing watched on both sides. Again, beautiful nod to the fact that at the end of the day, despite all the hate, despite all the war, despite all the needless blood loss of life, at the end of the day, we're people who have similar needs, similar wants, similar desires, both watching the exact same match of Syria versus Israel in a soccer match. And so he elongates the transmission to talk about the game, and in addition, asks about whether or not they received the singer sewing machine. Not important in the moment, but huge going forward in the story. At the same time, we know that things are heating up as viewers. We just don't have any evidence, but it's clear. You can feel it in the air as you're watching that this Sweidani's paranoia is going to translate into a heightened sense of security, which is not going to work out well for Eli. But he's a man on a mission, and he, again, takes what I'm going to argue are sometimes unnecessary risks. We see him breaking into the Minister of Information's office while he's using Eli's apartment for a tryst. He goes in, he photographs secret documents, and of course is discovered in the office by Sweidani. I thought, not knowing how the director was going to get us to the end, I thought at that point he was done. Again, a real edge of the seat kind of moment where I'm screaming at the screen and I'm telling Eli what to do, and of course he can't hear me. But I couldn't help myself. That's how well of a job I'm arguing the director did. He's discovered in the office by Sweidani. He gives some sort of mamby-pamby excuse. It doesn't seem to register, but it just doesn't seem to be important because Sweidani is then taking him to the office of the president. We don't know at the time where he's being taken, but we're happy to see that he's not being arrested for being in the office, and the pictures remain safe. He's then taken to the office of the president for this, in my opinion, extremely difficult conversation that we are forced to listen to. It's a conversation about water. It's a conversation very, very true to the historical information and background that the story is based on. He shares with Eli this insidious plan, the water diversion plan. And what's the plan? They plan to cut the supply of water, or divert the supply of waters of two of the major Jordanian rivers that feed into Lake Tveria, or the Sea of Galilee, thus really, really, really curtailing the amount of water that Israel can access, that it is using via its water carrier project to bring water throughout to bring water throughout the land of Israel. It was not only just having to listen to the plan that I found difficult to watch as the viewer, and me being me. I thought the reference of, you know, water being a source of life, the way the feeling of hate that sort of came through the screen in that discord was palpable. And of course, the reference of toasting l'chaim to Israel's demise and destruction was particularly difficult for me to watch. But I think, again, masterfully included by the director, who just a few, like half an episode prior, had me feeling feelings of sorrow for the nephew of the deposed colonel. So a bit of an emotional roller coaster ride, but this scene was really important and refocusing for me as a viewer, coming to the story with the historical background and understanding that I have. At the same time, he also makes him a really, really amazing author. He wants to promote him. Ellie asks him at the time of this discord about this, war for water that's about to happen. Why are you telling me this? And he answers him, because you're part of the family. And because you're part of the family, I'd like to promote you to the Deputy Minister of Defense position. I mean, in terms of score, huge score for the mission. I mean, just unprecedented that a spy for the Mossad could find himself actually holding the position of Deputy Minister of Defense. I mean, there's no way we could have planned it any better. But at the same time, we know that there's going to be a huge cost associated. It means, deepening his roots. It means having to move forward with the engagement to potential marriage. It means him, just having to lose himself that extra step more that we know is a line that he's finding extremely difficult to cross. We then switch back to the Prime Minister meeting in Zurich with other ministers, trying to, not in Zurich, I'm sorry, back in Israel, the Prime Minister Eshkol meeting with all of his other ministers around him, trying to figure out what Ellie should answer. And the next thing we know, we switch back to his homecoming, and he's getting together with the family to enjoy a beautiful meal that his wife has put together. And his brother comes, as it would be normal, and he sees the Singer sewing machine, and he puts 2 and 2 together immediately and gets 4. That's where the episode leaves us. In my notes, I asked myself a question. His brother knows he's Agent 88. The question is, does Nadia know as well? And it's a question that remains unanswered for us as viewers, I think, all the way, sadly, to the end of the episode, the end of the series, rather, when she's unfortunately confronted with the news of his capture. And then at that point, we know she's read into the entirety of the situation. I think it's a question we need to ask ourselves. She was an intelligent woman. There's no question. She was extremely capable. She was strong beyond words. What she accomplished, what she had to accomplish in the face of such huge sacrifice is worthy of note, to say the least. So one could only really surmise that a person of that level of intelligence had to have figured that something wasn't kosher with the story that she was being told. And certainly in the last episode, when he comes home for the last time, she can tell that something has shifted for him. She can tell from the nightmares and whatnot that the level of stress that he's under and the worry that he's under, and the fact that he actually comes out and tells her that he's afraid to go, has to raise all kinds of alarm bells for her. And I wonder, you know, even in that discourse in the bedroom, whether or not she's answering him not to go with the understanding that he shouldn't go back to whatever secret mission he's actually doing, or whether she's counseling him not to go back with his job as this buyer for the ministry. Not sure what the answer is, but it made for just absolutely beautiful watching for the viewer, but an absolutely gut-wrenching experience all the same. Okay, so that takes us to the end of episode 5. Episode 6, the end of the series, very appropriately entitled Home, begins January 24th, 1965. It begins with soldiers positioning themselves outside of his apartment, getting ready to storm in and arrest him under the direction of Sweetie, his nemesis, and shifting back and forth with Nadia on the phone with the Parisian office, and then switches back to the actual timeline in Syria before his arrest. Then we see her dressed in black in a car on her way to the Syrian embassy in France, where she's about to plead with the ambassador to arrange his release under the Geneva Convention. That's where the credits open. We're then immediately whisked back to 5 months previous. Again, these jumps between realities and timelines could have easily been extremely confusing for the viewer if they weren't done well. I'm going to argue, as I've done in the past, that they were not only done well, but they were done masterfully. I think it was important for us to understand things out of order, for this feeling of unease and disjointedness that those kind of, I don't know if I can call them flashbacks, but those starts and stops to these symbiotic stories that are happening in parallel was really, really important for us to feel in order to understand what the director wanted us to understand. And in particular, in the crescendo towards the end and his ultimate arrest and torture and murder, equally important. So we're whisked to 5 months earlier when he's visiting home for the last time. We know a little bit now more about the water diversion project. We understand what the Syrian plan is. We understand the the importance of the agricultural machinery that bin Laden was involved in bringing into the country. And we also understand the Soviet involvement within all of those goings on. Up until now, we knew that there was definitely Soviet involvement in terms of munitions and weaponry, but their involvement in that piece of the puzzle up until now was not as clear, and a very, very important fact for us to understand. We switch then to another strategic meeting where you see, the various ministers arranged with army captains and people in high Israeli military positions seated around a table, very much similarly to some high corporate environments where the people in the biggest amount of power are sitting closest to the table, and in concentric circles going out, people still involved in the project, involved in what's going on, but seated further and further toward the circumference given the hierarchy of their position. We see Dan sitting at the table. He pleads with the ministers who are trying to figure out what Ellie's decision should be vis-a-vis his promotion to Deputy Minister of Defense. And Dan asks them not to send him back if they plan to attack Shalal. Don't forget, Shalal is the part of the underground bunker system, military system that they've been working on this entire time. Key defensive position for them. in terms of raging attacks and wars against Israel. He pleads with them not to send him back if they plan to attack Shalal. It becomes very clear that from a defensive perspective, they need to attack Shalal, but equally important to them from a defensive perspective, they do plan to send Eli back to accept the promotion of Deputy Minister of Defense, because as anybody can understand, it's just too good of an opportunity for the government to turn up. And never in their wildest dreams would the Mossad have ever figured that Eli could have done a job so well to ingratiate him so high up into the military ranks, to be put into a position, to actually be offered such an important position, which would allow them unprecedented access to invaluable defensive information. Now, why did I bring up that whole corporate environment? I thought that scene was also just fantastic. We've seen Mayan. That's Don's assistant. We've seen her throughout the story. We surmise that she at one time was romantically involved with Dan, that relationship ends, that she still has an interest, and the next thing we know, she's pregnant through her marriage. But she almost plays a little bit of a Jiminy Cricket type of role for Dan. She also helps us as viewers to move the story along for us in terms of better understanding Dan's past and understanding his guilt, and understanding why he involves himself so personally with Nadia. And then to see her transition from Dan's own personal conscience to step out of the ranks of her position and speak up as, I'm going to add, the only woman in the entire room. I know it's the 60s, but still. And she comes up with a suggestion. What does she suggest? If you're going to attack Shalal, and if you're going to insist that you send Eli back, the best approach would be to wait until after his appointment and allow for some small Syrian victories to occur that won't have cost Israel all that much before attacking Shalal. In this way, obviously, maintaining his cover and allowing him to continue to do the job that they're ostensibly sending him back to do. Because otherwise, if the timing isn't correct, they're going to put two and two together and figure out who he is. What's the first question that gets asked in the room? Who is she? And they explain, and then the focus immediately shifts to the fact that her idea is absolutely the way to go. It was triumphant to watch for me. I loved it. Only woman in the room. I know it's the 60s. I know I said that right, but only woman in the room. Just saying. Okay. Then we shift back to this family dinner where his brother Maurice confronts him as knowing he's Agent 88. He begs him not to go back. Eli keeps his cover. I don't understand why. I don't know if it was for himself that he kept his cover. It certainly wasn't for the benefit of his brother. His brother's a Mossad agent. It's not as if, breaking cover and talking to him in a real truthful way would have put either of their jobs at risk, nor would anybody, I think, fault either one of them as members of the same family having a frank and honest discussion about what was actually going on. But I think that he maintains his cover because he's trying to hold on to this identity, at least until he knows whether or not he's going to be able to finally let it go. In other words, that Israel is going to thank him for his service and let him live his life in peace in Israel with his wife and his family, or whether or not he's going to continue to have to maintain this identity. Then a sort of a really poignant and important series of events happens. He's upset, Eli. He's upset because he knows what he's giving up. He knows what they're asking her to give up. He knows the kind of lifestyle that he's been enjoying in order to maintain his cover in Syria. He gets upset that his wife, um, married to him, a woman and a man of his position, even if it's the cover position of this buyer, really should be better taken care of by the country for which he's working. She should have her own phone. She should have her own television. She protests. It's not necessary. She's managing. He's not interested. It's at the least in his mind's eye what the country should be doing to take care of his family. So we shift to the department store where he had previously worked as a clerk before starting his whole journey and transition into a Mossad agent. And upon leaving the store, they get confronted by the security guard asking for identification and receipts. I mean, it was important for us to see it. It was difficult for us to see it as viewers as well. It was the reality, and sadly continues to be in some cases the reality in Israel, that there is racial discrimination and profiling based on how someone outwardly appears. We know that Ellie's features were more Arab in nature, which made him, among the many other skills that he brought to the table, so extremely well suited for the job. But again, it's being confronted with this outward action which solidified for him those feelings of inadequacy, of not belonging, which I have been arguing all along was a really big force and impetus in terms of why he decided to actively pursue his role in the Mossad as vehemently as he did, because he didn't feel that he belonged, and he felt that he needed to prove something, and that this not only influenced his decision to take on the role, but also influenced the amount of risk that he would take as the mission evolved. He gets arrested. And obviously, we know who he is. We know that obviously Don is going to work whatever he needs to work, but it happens, and it's significant for the reasons that I just mentioned. Nadia confronts him. She tells him clearly she doesn't believe him. There's something going on. He's mumbling names in his sleep. Ellie, at this point, wants Don to tell her the truth, wants to be given permission to finally tell her the truth. And at the same time, when he's being denied, he himself realizes that he's changed. And that discourse with him and Dan, where he's explaining to him about the nightmares, he says something that was really, really poignant. He points out that the nightmares that he's having are Kamal's nightmares. The fears that he's having are not Ellie's, they're Kamal's. And he's gotten to the point where he's been in so long and he's in it so deep that he quotes, "I am pretending to be me." Now, to me, that should have been the breaking point. That should have been the point where Dan needed to step up and say, I'm this guy's handler. I know what's at risk. I know what the government, what the country needs. But if I care about this person at all, this is the time to pull him out, because he's reaching a tipping point. He's reaching a point of no return. But one will argue, at least I'm going to argue, in the pure form of a true Zionist, country before all, in a time where the fact that we were surrounded by enemies on every border whose sole aim was our destruction, our utter destruction, his response to him is, don't worry, you will remember who you are. Ellie's nightmare, he wakes up telling her that his hands are on fire. Again, foreshadowing of that horrible scene when we first see him at the beginning of the series with his fingernails pulled out. It's foreshadowing of the torture that is yet to come. We then shift back to this transition place in Zurich, the safe house in Zurich, where he, undergoes this metamorphosis for the last time. We, in the past, had seen the same room with the closet and the clothes neatly arranged on one side with the sliding door, closing off Ellie and bringing Kamel El Thabit back into the forefront, into the reality, into Ellie's reality. This time, things are very different. This time, sadly, those clothes, those Ellie clothes, the identity of Ellie, we see them strewn haphazardly, disrespectfully, fully discarded and strewn across the floor. Another nod to what's to come, and really difficult to watch. He says goodbye to his mother figure, the wife, the handler in Zurich. And you can tell by their embrace, you can tell by the look on her face that she knows it's the last time she's going to see him. And I think he knew it too, that this was the last time he was going to see her. Next, we switch back to his reality in Syria. He obviously he accepts the position, he moves the relationship on. All the while, this heightened sense of paranoia within the government, within the country, is on the rise. And we now see Russian involvement in terms of agents in a van using Russian surveillance equipment to sweeping neighborhoods, trying to ascertain if there is an unnecessary transmission. Now, what alerted Sweetani to this in the first case? It was that sports match. That sports match, which both the Syrians and Israelis were watching on the television at the same time, that sports match that elongated Ellie's transmission time with, we now know, his brother, which caused a disturbance in the television signal that Sweetani happens to notice. Why? Because he's the nemesis and he's paranoid, and it has to be him that's going to be ultimately responsible for bringing Ellie down. And as a result, he starts to investigate what might be happening, because he asks the guy, how often does this happen? And what does he tell him? Every morning at 8 and every night at 8. We as viewers know exactly the importance of those times. Those were the scheduled transmissions within which Ellie was instructed to transmit. So they start turning off the power while they sweep neighborhood to neighborhood, trying to ascertain where potentially there might be an additional signal being transmitted. We're then treated to another really confidential conversation between the president and Ellie, finding out that the second part of his plan, not only the water diversion plan, not only Shalal, but at the same time, Syria is now going to begin funding Arafat's Fatah PLO, soon to be PLO, terror cell. They are going to train guerrilla soldiers in Syria to attack Israel in guerrilla style, as we know is 100% true. And again, we're treated to his celebratory exuberance around the fact that the plan is so brilliant. Why? Because Israel will be constantly attacked by these PLO guerrillas, but they won't have enough in which to gain world support for the seriousness of the threat that they are being posed with, because it's not an organized army, it's guerrilla warfare. And because they won't get world support, then there's no way that Syria can be blamed. It's going to drive Israel crazy. And Ellie has no choice but to tell him how brilliant his plan is. He proposes to the daughter and accepts the deputy minister of defense position. Meanwhile, roving blackouts. Ellie doesn't connect 1 and 1 to get 2. He is ordered, specifically ordered by the Israeli side to remain silent. But he defies the orders because he wants to advise them of Arafat's, that Arafat's guerrilla army is ready to become operational. And he's found. When do we see him found? He's found having just fixed himself breakfast of what? Bread and butter. Again, another nod to this love of his life that he's now about to have to sacrifice forever. He, with a huge show of force, we now circle back to where the episode began. Now with the force of men coming into the apartment, arresting him while he's in transmission. He rushes to the bathroom. He goes to try to get the cyanide pill out of that pill bottle, which we haven't seen since the first time that his bags were packed by his handlers in Zurich. He gets it in his hands, but unfortunately he's not able to take the cyanide. We then see a really, again, just as a nod to the mastery of the visual picture that the director treats the viewer to. We see newspapers being read on both sides. We know that the slant in which things are being reported couldn't be more different, but we know that the subject of the story is exactly the same. Again, I think a nod in terms of us understanding that while we're very, very different at this instance and point in history in terms of the country's viewpoint and desires for its people, at the end of the day, there's a lot of things that are the same. The Prime Minister of Israel authorizes that any deal should be made to bring him back. But Nadia knows that no such deal will be struck, because at this point it becomes a matter of saving face for Syria within the Arab world, a fact that I think rings true, and I'm going to try to bring to light in the source sheets, one of the source sheets that I prepared for you. The series sadly ends exactly where it began, in the cell, but what's different is the perspective. So at the beginning, the camera angle is behind Ellie looking at the rabbi. Now the camera angle has shifted from Ellie's viewpoint to the rabbi's viewpoint. And I think that's really, really important. We then shift seamlessly back and forth between Nadia and him at the point of his execution. She knows what's happened even before the radio reports it. She can feel it. She can feel the moment in which their connection is cut short. And of course, those words spoken by the rabbi very poignantly, "You do not know who you are," as he's encouraging him to sign the letter. We don't get a lot in terms of our view of the letter. We don't get enough for us to be able to read it. I don't think it's important that we know or that we're allowed into that intimate space represented within that letter. We know that he writes in French, and we know that at the end of the letter, despite his struggle, he does eventually come back to himself and sign the letter Ellie. Then of course ensues, a very, very difficult bunch of scenes to watch, true to history, no doubt. He's shackled, he's spat on, he's forced to walk through a crowd to the gallows, positioned on the side in positions of honor, is a gallery of important people meant to be witness and audience to his execution. He refuses the hood, and I think an actual last show of ultimate courage. He knows what's going to happen to them, what's going to happen to him, and he needs them to not be spared the ugliness of what they're about to do. He refuses the hood. He's forced to wear a sign in Arabic, which we can only surmise what it says. Interestingly enough, we're not presented with a translated version. I don't think it's important, again, for the viewer to know in actuality what the context of that sign was. In fact, in my research, I specifically chose not to look into what it said because to me, it is beside the point in every way. And he is he's hung, and his body is left there on May 18th, 1965 in the Mirage Square of Damascus to hang in disrespect for 6 hours. I then had to write down the quote that we see immediately after, and I just want to share it with you in case you missed it. 2 years after his death during the Six-Day War, the eucalyptus trees that Eli planted above the Syrian bunkers were used as targeting markers by the IDF, allowing them to take the Golan Heights in just 2 days. Miraculous, brilliant, again, at least one amazing thing of many, many amazing things that came out of this ultimate sacrifice. His body is never returned. Even 54 years later, his wife never remarries. And we then shift back again seamlessly, as the director has done in points previous, to actual footage of his body hanging with that horrible sign in disrespect for hours and hours on end. And the series ends with Dunn putting through a new recruit with the exact same test that we saw him put Ellie through, as a message to us that sadly, despite this ultimate sacrifice, despite the things that Ellie was able to accomplish in his mission as a Mossad spy, despite the countless lives he no doubt saved, unfortunately, the need has not changed. The need for spies to be recruited and sent into various key positions, it continues to be essential to the survival of the state of Israel. It was true then, it was true into the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and sadly, unfortunately, I would argue, even until today. Couple of other things I wanted to go over with you. I mean, it was a beautiful series. It was incredibly difficult to watch at many times, but just beautifully and masterfully done from both a creative and from a historical sense, I would argue. I give it a huge thumbs up. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the moth, and I'm hoping that I've answered the questions that I asked you to think about, but I printed them out just in case we needed to go over them together. The moth. I wondered why they included the moth at the beginning and in the credits of every episode. What was significant about that? So much so that I thought maybe perhaps it was actually tied to the factual real story, had something to do with, his handler name or something like that. I wasn't able to find any evidence of that. If somebody, can correct me to the contrary, I'd be happy to hear. But I'm going to argue that, again, the moth was inserted there by the director. Why? Because we see it very much alive at the beginning and we see it very much dead at the end. Unfortunately, the same story arc that Ellie's life takes as he sacrifices for his country. But also, I think, why a moth? It could have been a bird. It could have been anything else that flies. But a moth is drawn to light. A moth has to, I think, instinctively find the light, even at its own peril, which I would argue mirrors Ellie's story. He was drawn to this mission. He had a moral imperative. His psyche, his identity as an Israeli of Arab descent, the climate within Israel, the climate within his own life, his own demons, forced him to be drawn to the light that would ultimately kill him in the same way that the moth was killed. Also, a moth potentially can undergo metamorphosis. We know that in the case of some butterflies, they start off as caterpillars and then they cocoon themselves and they come out as something altogether different. also something to think about when we think about Eli's story. He starts often as one person, and I would argue through need, through ultimate devotion and dedication, there is a metamorphosis that takes place, albeit not in this case for the good, which creates a different entity altogether. And the cover that began, I would argue, in some cases, really took to became the dominant person, the dominant character. That so much so that he had to really search and find himself again. Um, as his story unfolded, and certainly at the point just before his death. Beautifully, expertly included, so small, just, this moth flittering. You could easily miss it in the credits if you weren't paying attention. You could easily miss the moth in the jail cell at the beginning and at the end. But again, I think put there masterfully and meant for us to notice, and meant for us to think about why it was there. Okay, we definitely talked about the emotional tolls and the mission experienced by Eli and his wife. There are too many really to count. As I said earlier, for us, watching the emotional tolls on Nadia throughout the course of the series was very telling and was very difficult. But I think it was paralleled in what we see happening to Eli at the end of the series, when it just becomes too much for him to bear. And nonetheless, he comes home and he goes back. How do you feel about the series ending where it began? I think it was masterfully done. I think it really was two bookends of an epic story. I think that if we come at that with the understanding that the director really wanted to highlight their relationship, it really couldn't have been done any other way. And then the last question, by far, I think is the hardest one for me to deal with, and I'm hoping that gave you a lot of pause and things to think about. I asked you throughout the series, the only visible connection that we see of Eli to his religious identity takes place moments before his death. What do you think that the director may have meant for us to understand as a result? I mean, from a story perspective, it makes perfect sense. I mean, he's at the point of his imminent execution. Obviously, he's going to request the presence of a rabbi, for him to undergo whatever religious rites he can, despite his position as a captive in enemy territory. But I think it was also, again, something perhaps that the director wanted us to contemplate on another level, especially within the context of Israeli history. We know, and he alludes to it many times before, that the country was built in the shadows of the Holocaust, and that obviously informed not only the people who had to pick themselves up physically, find strength from who knows where to undergo the task of building a country, creating a government, putting together an army, and on countless too many times having to rise up in defense of our existence. It also had, I think, an effect, we know, on the Jewish persona, on the Zionist persona, this whole idea of the Yehudi HaChadash, the new Jew, with the Kova Tembel, with the hat, the pioneer, who left behind all of the imagery and the associations with our religious past in many cases, in order to pick themselves up into a new Sabra identity necessary to build the country. And so I think perhaps it was also purposeful that we didn't see anything pointing to any kind of religious life on behalf of Eli, on behalf of his family, and certainly in the discourse that we see, in terms of when the story shifts back to Israel, that is completely not discussed. And I'm not sure. I would argue that I think it was pointful. I think it was meant for us to contemplate that and understand that discord in terms of how the country was built and what was going on historically at the time. I want to thank you for joining me. I hope that you found this series enjoyable to watch. I'm hoping that my reviews have helped you along with me, learn more about the history of Israel. Once again, this time I prepared a few source sheets for you. The first one is about the 1967 Six-Day War, given that the events of Eli's mission really hugely influenced what happened in particular in the Golan Heights. I thought it was really important for us to look a little bit more deeply at the Six-Day War, and not only what occurred, but what occurred and how that has influenced our current reality. So there's one about that. I wanted to spend a little bit of more time learning for myself, and hopefully with you as well, a little bit more about the water carrier project in Israel and the water diversion plan, and how it was received, and how that plan entered into the discourse between Israel and its albeit sometimes quiet, covert ally, the United States. So there's a really interesting article there from the CIA, all kinds of stuff from the Virtual Jewish Library and other sources that I'm hoping will have given you a better understanding about what was going on. And of course, the water carrier project itself, just this incredible technological, unbelievable back-breaking project that Israel undertook in the 60s. To bring water to the rest of the country. Oh, how far we've come from them till now. And then the third source sheet, I wanted you to have some factual information about Eli Cohen. I found some incredible articles from the Times of Israel, from the Times, and then also, really, really interestingly, it just as a nod back to what Nadia comes to understand, that no deal is going to be made because now the focus is about saving face. I found some articles from some other sources really speaking toward what we got so wrong, about what Netflix got so wrong, and what Gideon Raff, the Israeli director, got so wrong in telling Eli's story. Again, told from the perspective of saving face was fascinating. In particular, they spent a lot of time really getting upset about the scene where the sheikh that had been, he was arrested but then released, but the sheikh who takes his hat off, who had been responsible for bringing Eli in his persona Kamal al-Thabit into Syria, thus setting all the things in motion. We see in just as he's about to be hung, him take off his hat. This created a huge uproar, and was definitely there was a lot of time spent about why this was so woefully inaccurate. So I wanted you to get a little taste of that. And then some articles, more modern articles coming out of the situation with a Syrian descendant who claimed to have valuable information about where Eli's body and remains were buried. And a whole thing that went back and forth with the ransom and so forth. Also a really difficult but important video clip of an interview of Nadia when she actually responds to watching the Netflix series The Spy, which I just had to share with you. So I hope that you guys enjoy all of those. And I hope you'll continue to join me as I try to figure out where we go from here. My plan is to still stay in the Netflix environment, just because for ease of everybody being able to find things to watch. But you'll have to stay tuned to figure out where I'm going to go next. I wish you guys continued amazingly good health, and I continue to wish you sanity, and I hope that you guys continue to enjoy all the different programs that we're putting forward for you. It's our way of keeping you close and letting you know that we're thinking about you, and trying to offer you as much quality stuff as we possibly can. And I just wish you happy continued streaming. See you soon.